Many of you will have seen this harrowing video from Gaza that was broadcast by ITV. It showed the moments in Khan Yunis when an innocent civilian was shot dead by IDF sniper fire. A group of men carrying a white flag trying to rescue family members. Then a volley of shots rings out, and one man, Ramzi Abu Sahul, is struck in the chest. Another man places the flag on his wound, and they try to carry him to safety. But the 51-year-old father and husband sadly dies. That video was shown to Labour leader Keir Starmer last night on ITV's Peston. And as a former human rights lawyer, you'd expect him to care about international humanitarian law. In theory, you couldn't find anyone better placed to call a war crime a war crime. Let's take a look.
You are a very experienced lawyer. Surely that was a war crime.
Well, Robert, first I have to say I haven't seen the footage yet. I've been working around the clock, haven't stopped today yet. I will, of course, see it. I've been sent the link to it, but I haven't seen it yet. But what I would say is this. We've been absolutely clear throughout this that, yes, of course, Israel has the right to self-defense, but it's got to be in accordance with international law. And they're two sides of the same coin. It's why we've said that the ICC should be in there with jurisdiction with the prosecutor gathering evidence, because there's got to be accountability under international law. What I don't think is wise, and this is, we're always being asked to do this, is for politicians to sit looking at clips on social media or on programmes and forming instant judgments about whether it's a breach of this law or that. That doesn't seem to be wise, but I don't recoil from the fact, or don't resile from the fact, that of course Israel has got to comply with international law. And of course that means the accountability mechanisms need to be there, of which the prosecutor is one, which is why we support that.
Israel isn't even a member of the ICC and it prosecutes individuals. But also, what more evidence could you need before saying this might be a war crime? Because it's right there in the footage. Nobody's asking Starmer to judge definitively whether this is in fact a war crime. It would be enough just to say the video provides grounds for suspecting Israel of committing those crimes and calling for immediate ceasefire so an investigation can take place. The same way he was able to say, I believe that Israel has the right to self-defense. Now, Starmer gave obviously quite a lawyerly answer there. Due process, independent investigation. But it seems like there are some politically expedient cases where human rights high flyer Keir Starmer has been quite happy to give a very different response.
With your lawyer's hat on, is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
Yes.
Yes.
What I've seen already amounts to war crimes, particularly the awful attacks on civilians. And I think it's very important that he's held to account and is responsible. And all those that are acting with him know that they too will be held to account. And this is something which we need to make clear now, so that those who are involved at the moment know what the consequences are. Russian aggression in Ukraine is undoubtedly a breach of international law, and I've already, for myself, seen images of war crimes being committed. So I'd also like us all to say with one voice that anybody who is responsible for these war crimes, and they are war crimes in Ukraine, will be hunted down and held to account before the International Criminal Court.
Polly, I'm interested. Obviously, where the spaces we tend to exist, it feels like Starmer's fence sitting is doing a massive amount of damage. But I saw a really interesting poll recently from More in Common, which said that people actually don't mind so much what that Labour aren't really doing anything and would prefer them to have a united response with the government. Do you think that his fence sitting is going to hurt him?
I don't think what we saw in that clip is anything new from Starmer. I suppose it depends which constituencies you talk about when you say, will they mind, will they care? I think certainly if you have a shred of conscience, it's impossible to watch that clip of him, refusing to comment on whether or not the video we played is a war crime. I find it actually disturbing, the flippancy with which he's able to discuss these things. It's completely in keeping with the conduct of him and other Labour politicians throughout, since October. I find it inhumane that someone could talk about, a genocide that has created so many orphans that it has necessitated the need for an entirely new acronym, WC, NSF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. It's such a classic case of political manoeuvring that Starmer is asked to comment on whether or not what he's been shown was a war crime. And he makes it a question of whether or not he should be called to judge on what he calls clips on social media, which I just think is, such a sleight of hand. It shows us the completely flawed logic, that we see time and time again in these discussions about international law, where Starmer invokes the International Criminal Court as a mechanism for accountability that allows the suspension of actual accountability in the here and now. So Starmer can get away with saying, well, I don't need to exercise any power to intervene and prevent these war crimes because down the line, we have mechanisms that will, that should hold Israel accountable. And we've seen that problematic logic again and again throughout, since October.
Yeah, I agree. Something that was actually also interesting in this study was, first of all, it found that support for a ceasefire was not the majority opinion in the UK, even though people express this great sympathy with civilians. Also found that people are mostly split on in Britain which sides they take in what they call a conflict. But the fascinating thing was that people who are pro-Israel are much less likely to be active, whereas pro-Palestinian individuals are much more likely to have gone on a protest, to really be active in trying to lobby for a ceasefire and also hold the cause closer to their heart, I think was the language they used in this study. Things to think about there. And of course, it's not just on this side of the pond that mealy-mouthed liberals can't call a war crime a war crime. In the US, ITV put its video to State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel.
I wonder what your response to that is and whether you think from watching that video whether that potentially represents a war crime.
I have seen that footage, but I am not going to comment on the specifics around that, given I'm not aware of the full circumstances on the ground. And as we've said before, this is not an American operation. But beyond that, please don't. I'm happy to take your questions if you'll allow me. To answer. I don't interrupt you, and I ask you to not do the same. As a general matter, though, we have not parsed our words about the moral and strategic imperative that the government of Israel and the Israeli security forces have to take every effort possible to minimize civilian casualties and minimize impact on civilians. As it relates to the footage that your organization has shared, again, I'm just going to refrain from commenting on specific operations as we do not have full circumstances of what on the ground from here. This isn't an American operation. I'm not on the ground there to speak to the full parameters of the situation. Any civilian death is heartbreaking, and any civilian life lost is one too many. And we have made that clear with the Israelis, and will continue to do so.
Beyond that comment about it being heartbreaking, which is a platitude we often hear, would you urge, given that you broadly support the IDF operations in the Gaza Strip, would you support a Israeli investigation of what happened in that video? Given that they're waving a white flag and they represented no threat.
That is for the IDF to undertake and determine based on the circumstances of that situation.
Thoughts and prayers from the State Department there, but the journalists in the room weren't having it. And the line of questioning that followed gave an interesting insight into how nervous the US is about holding Israel accountable for its actions.
How about the footage that arose last week and the week before and the week before and the week before and the week before, where there have been, if not similar, awfully close instances? Have you ever gotten an explanation from the Israelis? Have you ever gotten a finding from the Israelis of what their investigation, if they promised one?
I'm not going to speak to private diplomatic conversations, Matt, but this is something that we raise continuously with the Israelis The secretary has done so. Other officials in our government have done so, and will continue to do it.
Okay. Well, have you ever gotten an answer from the Israelis?
I'm just not gonna. I'm not gonna speak to the privacy of certain diplomatic conversations, Matt. But we have been clear that there is a moral and strategic imperative to take as many steps as possible to minimize civilian casualties.
That's fine. That's fine that you say that. But then when you are asked specific questions like this relating to specific footage, and this is not the first time that this has happened. You've been asked repeatedly about this, and then you come back and say, well, we've raised questions with you. We've asked the Israelis questions. Have you ever gotten a response to any of those?
These conversations.
I'm not asking you for the details. I just want to know.
We have. These conversations are private. We have raised with the Israelis specific circumstances, and we have
you have
received
gotten answers?
Correct. I'm not going to speak to those conversations right now.
In any case, are you aware of that the Israelis say, we screwed up here?
I'm just not going to speak to the private conversations, Matt.
And on this one, just to close this, since you sounds like you haven't had a chance to ask about this one, are you planning to ask about this particular instance or no?
I'm just not going to speak to specific diplomatic conversations.
Talk isn't cheap because while all this rhetoric flies, more lives are being lost. And I want us to remember that.